Beelzebub's Tales to His Grandson, Chapter 33. Beelzebub as a Professional Hypnotist. Beelzebub continued to relate further as follows. When I existed among your favorites as a professional hypnotist, I made my elucidating experiments upon their psyche, chiefly by means of that said particular state of theirs, which the contemporary beings there call the hypnotic state. For bringing them into this state, I had at first recourse to the same means by which the beings of the period of the Ticleomitian civilization brought each other into this state, namely by acting upon them with my own Khanbled-Zoin. But when later, there often began to arise in my common presence the being impulse called love of kind, and apart from my personal aims, I had to produce this said state in very many three-brained beings there for their personal benefit. And as this means proved very harmful for my being existence, I invented another means, thanks to which I obtained the same effect, without the expenditure of my own Khanbled-Zoin. I then invented, and very soon became expert in, quickly changing the mentioned difference of the filling of the blood vessels by means of a certain hindering of the movement of the blood in certain blood vessels. By means of this hindering, I obtained the result that although the already mechanized tempo of the blood circulation of their waking state remained in beings, yet at the same time their real consciousness, that is, the one which they themselves call subconsciousness, began also to function. This new means of mine proved, of course, incomparably better than that which is used even up till now by beings of your planet, who make the person they hypnotize gaze at a shining or brilliant object. It cannot be denied that, as I've already told you, it is possible to bring them into such a psychic state by making them fix their gaze on a brilliant or bright object. But not all beings there, not by a long way, the reason being that although from their fixed gaze on a shining object there may proceed in their general blood circulation the change of the filling of the blood vessels, nevertheless, the chief factor for this must be the, on their part, intentional or automatic concentration of thought and feeling. And this latter can be obtained in them either from an intense expectation or from the process proceeding in them which they express by the word faith, or from the arising emotion of the sensation of fear of something about to happen, or finally from the function already contained within the presence of the given being, which they call passions, for instance, hate, love, sensuality, curiosity, and so on and so forth. That is why in beings called there hysterical, in whom there is lost temporarily or forever the possibility of concentration of thought and feeling, it is impossible by means of fixing their gaze upon a shining object to obtain in their blood circulation the change of the difference of the filling of the blood vessels, and hence it is almost impossible to obtain in them this said hypnotic state. But by the means I invented, namely a definite action upon the blood vessels themselves, it was possible to bring into this state not only anyone you please of these three-brained beings who have taken your fancy, but even also many one-brained and two-brained beings breeding there, as for instance various what they call quadrupeds, fishes, birds, and so on and so forth. But as regards the said impulse, love of kind, which led me to seek for a new means of bringing your favorites into such a state which had already become proper to them, this arose in me and gradually became dominant in me for a while, chiefly because during these therapeutic activities of mine, Ordinary three-brained beings there, belonging to all castes, here, there, and everywhere, soon began to love and esteem me, and to consider me almost as one sent to them from above to help them to deliver themselves from their pernicious habits. In short, they began to manifest towards me their most sincere, almost genuine being impulse of oskolniku, or as they themselves say, thankfulness and gratitude. This being oskolniku, or gratitude, was manifested towards me not only by those I saved, and by those nearest to them, but by almost everybody who had been in this or another way in contact with me or who had heard of me, but only with the exception of those professionals among them who were their physicians. These latter, on the contrary, hated me in the extreme, and would strain every nerve to impair somehow the good feelings which arose in ordinary beings towards me, and they hated me simply because I very soon became their serious rival. Strictly speaking, they had indeed cause to hate me, because already after only a few days of my therapeutic activities, hundreds of patients used to attend my daily consultations, and hundreds of others tried to become clients of mine, while my poor rivals had to sit for long periods in their famous offices and impatiently wait for any odd patient who might stray in like a lost sheep. They waited for these lost sheep with great impatience, because certain of these latter were transformed into what are called milch cows, from which they milk, as was already customary there, that something which they defined by the word oof, or dough. All the same, justice demands this to be said for them, that during recent times it was indeed quite impossible to exist there without this oof, and particularly for those three-brained beings who are there the contemporary famous physicians. And so, my boy, I began my activities in the capacity of a physician-therapist, as I've already told you, in the center of the continent Asia, in various towns of Turkistan. I was first in the town of that part of Turkistan which later came to be called Chinese Turkistan, in contradistinction to that part of it which, from the time of its conquest by beings belonging to the large community Russia, has been called Russian Turkistan. There was a very great need in the towns of Chinese Turkistan for such a physician as I then became, because among the three-brained beings breeding on this part of the surface of this planet of yours, there was developed at that period, more strongly than usual, two forms of their most pernicious, what are called organic habits, which also had become proper to be acquired in the presences of the beings of that ill-fated planet. One of these pernicious organic habits was what is called there the smoking of opium, and the other was the chewing of anasha, or as it is otherwise named, hashish. They obtained this opium, as you already know, from the plant poppy, and hashish from a surplanetary formation there called chakla, or hemp. As I've just said, at this period of my activities, my existence passed at first chiefly in various towns of Chinese Turkistan, but circumstances so fell out that later I preferred to be in the towns of Russian Turkistan. Here among the beings of Russian Turkistan, one of the said pernicious habits, as they themselves call them vices, namely the smoking of opium, was very rare, and the chewing of anasha was even rarer. But on the other hand, the use of what is called Russian vodka flourished luxuriantly there. This maleficent means is obtained there chiefly from the surplanetary formation called the potato. From the use of this said vodka, not only does the psyche of the ill-fated three-brained beings there become, just as from opium and anasha, also utterly nonsensical, But in addition, certain important parts of their planetary body also gradually completely degenerate. Here I may say, my boy, that it was just then, at the beginning of these activities of mine among your favorites, that I instituted for the purpose of better conducting my investigations in the domain of their psyche, those statistics of mine which later on gradually interested certain most very saintly cosmic individuals of a higher gradation of reason. Well then, while I existed as a physician there, among the beings breeding in the towns of Turkistan, I had to work so hard, especially towards the end, that certain functions of my planetary body began to get out of order, and I began to consider therefore how to manage to have the possibility, at least for a certain time, of doing nothing but only rest. I could of course return to my home on the planet Mars for this purpose, but then there arose before me my personal individual being dimzoniro, that is, my being duty towards what is called the essence word I had given to myself. And this essence word I had given to myself, when beginning my sixth descent, was to exist there among your favorites until such time as I should finally have made clear to my mind all the facts which were the causes of the gradual formation of the mentioned exclusively strange being psyche of their common presence. Well then, as by that time I had still not fulfilled this essence word which I had given myself, that is to say, I had not yet had time to learn all the details needed for a full elucidation of the problem, I considered a return to the planet Mars premature. But to remain in Turkistan and to organize my existence there in such a way as to have the full possibility of giving my planetary body the required rest, I could not in any way, because in almost all the beings there on that part of the surface of your planet, breeding in both Chinese and Russian Turkistan, there had already been crystallized, either through personal perception or from the descriptions of others, data for recognizing my appearance. At the same time, each of the ordinary beings of this country wished to speak with me concerning either himself personally or his nearest, on account of one of the vices in the deliverance from which I had chanced to become there such an unparalleled specialist. What I then devised and carried out to escape from this situation was the reason why Turkistan, concerning which place there are and will be preserved in my common presence the data then fixed for pleasant memories, ceased to be for me the place of my permanent existence on your planet at the period of this last stay of mine. And thereafter the cities of the famous Europe, with their cafes with the black liquid, made of nobody knows what, replaced the towns of Turkistan with their chaikanas and their delicious fragrant teas. I decided to go to the country which is a part of the continent Africa and is there called Egypt. I chose this country because Egypt was indeed at that period the best place for resting, and many three-brained beings there possessing what is called material wealth went there for that purpose from all the other continents. Having arrived there, I settled down in the city called Cairo, and very soon organized the external form of my ordinary existence in such a way as to have that rest for my planetary body after the said intense and strenuous labors. Do you remember, I already told you that I was in this Egypt for the first time during my fourth appearance on the surface of that planet of yours, where I descended for the purpose of collecting, with the help of several beings of our tribe existing there, a certain number of the chance-arisen freaks called apes. And I furthermore then told you that I inspected in that country many interesting artificial constructions, among which was also that particular observatory which had then interested me for the observation of cosmic concentrations. At my sixth descent, of all the numerous interesting constructions that had previously existed there, scarcely anything existed any longer. They had all been destroyed, partly by the beings there themselves, thanks to what are called their wars and revolutions, and partly they came to be covered by sands. These sands were a consequence partly of those great winds I've already mentioned, and partly also of that planetary tremor which was afterwards called by the beings of this Egypt the Alnapusian earthquake. During this planetary tremor, an island, then called Siapura, situated on the north side of a still existing island called Cyprus, gradually, in a very peculiar way, entered into the planet during 5 terrestrial years. And while this process lasted, there proceeded in the surrounding great Salyakuryapnian space extraordinary what are called low and high tides, as a result of which a great deal of sand from beneath the Salyakuryap rose to the surface of this terra firma and mingled with sands of the already mentioned origin. Now, do you know, my boy, what has gradually arisen in me while I have been telling you all this about Egypt, and of what all my being has now already become finally aware, namely an unpardonable error I made in my tales concerning the three-brained beings breeding on the planet Earth? Do you remember that at one time I told you that not one of the achievements of the beings of past generations had ever reached beings of subsequent generations? Well, it has become aware in me that I have made a mistake about this. Not once during my preceding tales concerning these beings who have taken your fancy has there ever been recalled in my being association an event which took place there just one day before my flight forever from the surface of that planet, and which event proves that something after all did reach even your contemporary favorites from among the achievements of the beings of the remote past. The emanations of joy which then arose in me from my pardon by our all-just Creator, omnipotent endlessness, and from his gracious permission to me to return to the bosom of my first arising, must have prevented me from absorbing those impressions sufficiently intensely, for there to be in the corresponding part of my general whole such completely crystallized data as should engender in beings during being associations arising from the result of one-sourced manifestations, the repetitions of what has already been sensed. But now, as I was speaking of this contemporary Egypt, and there was revived before my being sight pictures of certain localities of that part of the terra firma surface of the planet which had once pleased me, the faint impressions I had previously of this said event there became gradually coated in me into a definite awareness, and to be clearly collected in me. Before telling you about this event there, which cannot be described otherwise than as sadly tragic, I must, for your more or less clear representations about it, once more tell you something about the three-brained beings there of the continent Atlantis, who then constituted the learned society under the name Achaldan. Certain members of this society, who already had some notion of the sacred omnipresent Ochidanoch, discovered, by their persistent labors, how to obtain from their own atmosphere, and also from certain surplanetary formations, each of its sacred parts separately. And by keeping these sacred cosmic force-bearing substances in a concentrated state, how to perform, with their help, their definite scientific elucidatory experiments, The learned members of the said Great Learned Society then also discovered, among other things, that they could, by means of the separately localized third part of the omnipresent Okidanok, namely by means of its sacred neutralizing force, or force of reconciling, bring every kind of planetary what are called organic formations into such a state that they remained forever with all those active elements contained in them at the given moment. That is to say, they could stop and absolutely arrest their future inevitable what is called decay. The knowledge of the ableness of such an actualization passed by inheritance to certain beings of this Egypt, namely to those initiated beings who were the direct descendants of the learned members of the Akkadans. Well, many centuries after the loss of Atlantis, beings of this Egypt, on the basis of the knowledge which had reached them, also discovered how, by means of that same sacred neutralizing force of the sacred Okidanok, to preserve the planetary bodies of certain of them forever in a non-decaying and non-decomposing state after the sacred Roscoano, or as they say, after death had proceeded in them. And indeed, by the time of my 6th visit to that planet, all the beings and everything which had been in this Egypt during my former visit had entirely ceased to exist, and not even any notion of it all was preserved. But those planetary bodies upon which they employed the mentioned means remained intact, and exist there, even to the present time. And these surviving planetary bodies are called by the contemporary beings mummies. The transformation of the planetary bodies into mummies was effected by the beings of Egypt by a very simple means. Namely, they kept the planetary body assigned for this purpose about half a month in what is there called castor oil, and later they introduced into it the sacred substance force dissolved in a corresponding way. Well, my boy, according to the researches and investigations of one of our countrymen who exists there even up till now, about which I was informed by an etherogram after my final departure from the surface of your planet, it turned out that once, when their process of reciprocal destruction began between the community of the beings breeding on this Egypt and the beings of a neighboring community, and when at the same time one of their, as they are called, pharaohs came to the end of his existence, the beings whose business it was to preserve the bodies of meritorious beings everlastingly were unable, owing to the approach of beings hostile to them, to keep the planetary body of this pharaoh in castor oil as long as was necessary, that is to say, half a month. But nevertheless they put this body into castor oil, placed it in a hermetically closed room, and having dissolved in a certain way the said sacred substance force, they introduced it into the said room, so as to obtain in this way what they wished. This definite sacred something would have remained for untold centuries in its pristine state among these three-brained beings who have already long ago no reverence in their essence. But, as in the presences of these contemporary, as it is possible to call them, unconscious sacrilegists, a criminal passion has arisen that evokes in them a need to despoil even the sanctuaries of beings of past generations. They dug down even into this chamber which ought to have been for them a profoundly revered sanctuary, and they committed that blasphemous deed whose result is now the cause of my becoming aware with all my being of my mistake. Of just that mistake I made when I so confidently assured you that nothing whatever had reached the beings of the contemporary civilization from the beings of epochs long past. Whereas this said contemporary Egyptian event is a consequence of one result which reached them of the attainments of these ancient ancestors of theirs who used to exist on the continent Atlantis. Such a result of the scientific attainments of beings of long, long past epochs reached the contemporary beings and became their possession for the following reason. Perhaps, my dear Hussein, you already know, like all the responsible beings of our great universe, and even those still only at the period of the second half of their preparation to become such, even without regard to the degree of their being rumination, that the common presence of the planetary body of every being, and in general of any other relatively independent great or small cosmic unit, must consist of all the three localized sacred substances of force of the holy Triamazikamno, namely, of the substance forces of the holy affirming, holy denying, and holy reconciling, and that it must be sustained by them all the time in a corresponding and balanced state. And if for some reason or other there enters into any presence a superfluity of the vibrations of any one of these three sacred forces, then infallibly and unconditionally the sacred Raskoarno must occur to it. That is, the total destruction of its ordinary existence as such. Well, my boy, because there had arisen in the presences of your contemporary favorites, as I've already told you, their further criminal need to despoil the sanctuaries of their ancestors, and certain of them, with the purpose of satisfying their criminal needs, even forced open in the mentioned way the hermetically closed rooms, then the sacred substance force of the holy reconciling existing in these rooms, localized in a separate state, having had not sufficient time to blend with the space, entered into their presences, and actualized its property proper to it according to law. I shall say nothing now concerning just how and in what form the psyche of the three-brained beings breeding there on this part of the terra firma surface of your planet came to be molded. Some time later, perhaps, in its proper place, I shall explain this to you also, and meanwhile let us return to our interrupted theme. The program of my external existence in this said Egypt included, among other things, the practice of taking a walk every morning in the direction of what are called the pyramids and sphinx. These pyramids and sphinx were the sole chance poor surviving remains of those magnificent constructions which were erected by generations of the most great Akaldans, and by the great ancestors of the beings of this said Egypt, and of which I was a witness at my fourth sojourn on this planet of yours. I failed to have a thorough rest in this Egypt because of circumstances which soon led me to depart from there, and the circumstances that led me to my premature departure from Egypt were, strictly speaking, the reason why the towns of dear Turkistan with their pleasant chaikhanas were replaced, as I've already told you, by the cities of their famous contemporary cultured continent Europe, with the not less famous cafe restaurants, in which, as I have already told you, instead of fragrant teas, they offer you a black liquid consisting of nobody knows what.